Over the last year, I had the pleasure to work with Arne Durston on a very innovative, I would say, project, a EU project, the platform project, who has investigated the potential and the structure of e-commerce, food e-commerce. We started this project actually almost 3 years ago. We are nearly at the end of our journey. When e-commerce was very, food e-commerce was very still underdeveloped. And we survey with this project many different e-commerce platforms, studying their architecture and how they were growing and making and finding space in a very competitive food market. Then the pandemic appeared, and this project turned up to be a very interesting opportunity to study and to observing what was happening. We were at the time in the middle of our WIPI2, that was an in-depth investigation of from the point of view of consumer using this kind of platform, and to understand how their consumption practices, food consumption practices were changing, facing these new technological advancement. We obviously had to turn and to twist and to adjust our research on this new environment, but it was a very interesting challenge. We could observe in a way that was unexpected for us. Beside the food platform project, I'm also the coordinator of this group that is hosting this webinar. It is called COACT Group, that Margherita has already briefly presented. COACT means Collective Action, Change and Transition. We are a group of scholars beside the narrow group that is mainly concentrated on food, who is studying transition towards a more sustainable systems. We do not work only on international projects. We have some of them. One is just started. The topic is food diverse. You will hear about in the following years, probably. But we are also coordinating an outreach project that is called Nutrire Trento, Feeding Trento. That is a project you will hear about in my presentation. That is a local project involving the municipality of Trento together with the University of Trento. And it is for us a sort of living lab, as we can share our research results with farmers, local farmers, and other practitioners in the food sector. As we believe that municipality in these contingencies, in this situation, but even before the pandemic, needs to lead the process and have an important role in making spaces for small farmers and also to drive this innovation, this technological innovation that is happening in the food system. I would like to stop here and to leave the floor now to Arne to continue this round of presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I will thank you all for being invited to this event hosted by your institute and University of Trento. I think that the issue you are bringing up today is very important, both in terms of academic and societal impact. And I think, as Francesca already said, that COVID-19 has more than ever demonstrated the relevance of alternative food networks and e-commerce as an important solution to food security. And I think that this seminar could actually be one among very many initiatives to open up a new agenda and a new avenue of research. So thank you very much. My name is, as I told you, Arne Dulsrud. I am head of research at Consumption Research Norway. also called SIFO, and we are part of Oslo Metropolitan University. And SIFO is actually one of the very few pure social science institutes in Europe focused solely on consumption. Currently, we are around 30 researchers, including sociologists, political scientists, ethnologists, and economists. And as I already communicated to Francesca, and I will use this opportunity to reinstate that, we have a lot of common interests with your institute, both in terms of project, ideas, students exchange, etc. And I will welcome any communication and close collaboration on these issues, but we could talk more about this in another occasion. I'm a food sociologist by training, and my research has from the beginning focused on consumer policy and the food market, with an emphasis on the retail power in the food system, which is also relevant to the discussion we are having today. In recent years, I've been more focused on issues of food security. I was happy to coordinate and to collaborate on a project on food security and climate change in India, together with Bipul, who is also a participant of this panel here today. Currently, I'm coordinating two projects. One is platforms, and Francesca has already given a very proper and a very good presentation of the content of this project. And the other project I'm coordinating, which is relevant today, is about food security and violent conflict. And this is a project that newly started. It's taking place in southern region of Colombia. And we're actually studying the impacts of the COVID on the rural regions and sections of the population in the southern part of Colombia, where the conflict is a very pertinent issue. So I think this will be so much for this presentation, and I will return more deeply into these issues later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Anna Rapazza.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I am Anna Rapazza, and I'm working for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. I am currently working on a program that focuses on advancing governance innovation for food system transformation, increasing sustainability, resilience, and social equity of food systems at national level. But maybe how I got to the concrete work in assisting national governments in advancing the food system transformation agenda in Indonesia, Uganda, and Tanzania, I can just present you briefly where I come from. I started, and from which perspective do I speak and do I contribute to the dialogue today. I started my international career as a youth and women's representative in European institutions. At the time, I was lobbying and working on the policy and the governance level for youth participation and gender-oriented European youth policies. And from there, in particular, I was looking at girls and young women, and I was seconded by an international girls and young women organization to FAO to contribute to the World Food Summit follow-up, the first place that the global community sort of defined food security around 4 pillars, as well as defined a systemic approach needed to advance these food system transformations. At the time, digitalization and e-commerce were far from being relevant. After that, for many years, I participated to the global governance and regional governance of food and agriculture by, in particular, facilitating civil society participation. And for civil society, I mean here peoples-based organization, indigenous peoples, producers organization, fisher folks, nomadic communities, and so on and so forth, to the work in particular of the Committee for World Food Security and the governing bodies of food and agriculture at global and regional level within the FAO context. and then broaden the spectrum and the focus on governance in global governance processes. And I contributed to the negotiations of the Sustainable Development Goals by coordinating the technical team that provided the technical advice to governments that were from 2012, 2015, negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals. So I would contribute today from the perspective of the global, regional, and national governance of food and agriculture. And I see the emergence of the debate at those levels on the role of e-commerce and food networks, and a further analysis and policy debate on modalities to enable these to become inclusive and sustainable, and look at this from the perspective of impacts of those governance mechanisms and opportunities from a developing countries perspective. So in particular, more than the northern or global perspective as such, I will look at the global, regional, and national phenomenon related to food system transformation and digitalization, e-commerce, and food networks, from the impact on developing countries as countries and economies, and developing actors as rural actors in particular. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Anna. I now give the floor to Jordan Trickle.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Margherita and Francesca, for inviting me to this event. It's good to be here. My name is Jordan Trickle. I'm the National Programs and Policy Coordinator for the National Family Farm Coalition. NFFC is a farmer-led civil society organization based in the U.S. And since 1986, NFFC has been advocating on behalf of the family-scale farmers, ranchers, and fishermen. In sort of the international terminology, we'd say politically, we advocate on behalf of peasants, pastoralists, and fisher folk. So over the past decades, NFFC has really focused on addressing economic justice issues in the food system, looking at the systemic challenges that producers face to receive fair prices, to stay on their farms and in their rural communities, and trying to address the role of corporate concentration and the concentration of agricultural markets that have been marginalizing producers in North America since the 1980s and the 1980s farm crisis in this country. We also we primarily focus on federal advocacy or national policy in the US, but we've always done this work through international partnerships. We were a founding member of La Via Campesina in the United States, and we currently coordinate the North American region of the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism of the UN Committee on World Food Security. So we try to, NFFC is somewhat unique in the US as a national coalition in that we both try to integrate the on-land production systems with the fisheries sector and trying to see those connections from a very holistic food systems perspective of on land and at sea, as well as linking the national policy processes with international policy processes. So it's great to be part of this international discussion and bring these variety of different perspectives to this conversation, and we appreciate a farming organization having a seat at this discussion. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jordan. And last but not least, I give the floor to Vipul Chatterjee.
Thank you, Margherita. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on the time zone where you are. My name is Vipul Chatterjee. I'm Executive Director of Cuts International, which is a consumer advocacy group. I've been here working with Cuts for the last 25 years. Before that, I'm a trade economist, by the way. But more or less forgotten the economic theories which were taught in our classes. And that's one of the reasons why nowadays I do most of my work on political economic aspects of trade and development. So it's not just theory, but what's happening on the ground. That's my interest. Anyway, CUTS is, as I said, CUTS is a consumer advocacy group. We were established in 1983. And so over the last 3.5 decades, we are working on various aspects of consumer welfare, I mean, for enhancing consumer welfare. That doesn't mean that we are not looking into or working on producer side of the equation, because one has to look at both sides in order to have a holistic understanding of various issues, subjects which we are working on. And food security is one of them. As you know, that if you look at the United Nations guidelines on consumer protection, the first right, there are 9 rights now, earlier there were 8. The right to sustainable consumption has been added. The first right is right to basic needs. And within right to basic needs, there are 9 chapters. And the first chapter is right to food. So this is the basis of our work on food security. Broadly speaking, right now, we are working on 3 different strands, which is looking at food security and related issues, consumer welfare issues in a broad term in India, and also with our neighboring countries. One is where we are looking at how our farmers are doing organic farming, natural farming, what kind of markets that they're accessing, whether they're accessing immediate local markets or not, how they're expanding their marketing and market access. That's one. Secondly, we are also forming, in fact, we have already formed a number of them, farmer producer organizations, the farmer cooperatives in various parts of India, in 2 states in particular, Rajasthan and West Bengal, where we are particularly located. So that is, again, we are looking at how farmers can have better access to inputs on the one hand, and better marketing to get better prices for their produce. As you know, in India in particular, the markets are 2 segmented. So this and this is how we want to see how farmers' income can be enhanced over a period of time. Thirdly, we are also looking into the trade and food security linkages. This is where in the recent past, by recent past I mean a few years back, 2-3 years back, we worked very closely with CIFO and Arna in particular. So thank you, Arna. Good to see you again on the trade and food security linkages in India. In few states, household level food security and how internal trade are impacting that food security at the household level. And also at the cross-border level, we are working on how cross-border trade, particularly between India and our neighboring countries, can have impact on food security at the household level in various countries and particularly sub-regions, I would say. So broadly, this is what we are doing right now. E-commerce is another area where we are doing a lot of work from consumer point of view in particular. Particularly the regulatory work, the regulations in e-commerce. I'm looking forward to speak about some of these issues in my presentations today. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vipul. So we are in perfect timing, and without much ado, I will now leave the floor to the panelists to make their presentation, which, as you may see, their background is extremely different, and this is what makes especially interesting the panel. So the viewpoints are and presentation tackles partially different aspects, but what they share is an insight on how the pandemic crisis has had an impact on different actors of the food chain, from producers, consumers, and the role of alternative food networks and e-commerce in ensuring food security during this time. Another cross-cutting issue that is present in our presentation is the role of public institutions. So I will now give the floor to Arne Dolsrud. Arne, the floor is yours. I will now share the presentation.
Thank you, Margarita. I have titled the presentation Alternative Food Networks and E-commerce during the pandemic, but I could as well paraphrase the title and swap to food e-commerce safety with food e-commerce security, because I think security will be the focus more than safety. The pandemic has indeed demonstrated that food security is local and national and a global issue. And there are others in the panel today that will speak about the international dimensions. So or the global. So I will limit my discussion to more like a European and a regional perspective. Next slide, please. As I've said already, it's impossible to discuss the role of alternative food networks and e-commerce without taking into account what I've called a landscape shock of COVID-19. Here illustrated by a confused Prime Minister of Norway standing in the middle of downtown Oslo on an ordinary weekday in May last year, looking around. There are at least two ways of understanding the effects of COVID on food security. One is that COVID is a resilience test for the domestic and international food system, and the question how to reform its detrimental effects. So it's a more like a reformist perspective. A more pessimistic interpretation would be that the pandemic has demonstrated the shortcomings of the agro-industrial system. That is the interconnection between neoliberal political regimes, the food industry, and not the least, the powerful retailers of the Western economies. And I think from both point of views, food networks can be seen either as a solution or as an alternative. And I will address some of these challenges. Next slide, please. This figure illustrates something that most of you are familiar with, namely the pillars of food security. Namely that stability of access, availability, and food utilization is the major part or components. I think it's actually too early to make a general conclusion on the pandemic effects, but I think that we so far have experienced a diversity of consequences depending on the situation in the affected country and the measures introduced by the various countries. When it comes to availability, there's been lockdowns of markets, hoarding, and a fall in agricultural production, but also emergence of new modes of distribution. Access to food has been severely affected through loss of income, increased poverty, confinement, social isolation from markets, and also exclusion from public meals such as school lunches. So this has been actually some of the more dominant discussions about access to food and its limitations. Eating, diets, and meals have been affected. There's been an increase in snacking and cheap food, but also improved interest for the origin of food and a more diversified diet. And I think to sum up, to quote the British sociologist Anthony Giddens, high risk also comes with high opportunity. The virus has obviously food insecurity impacts, but also opportunities for innovation. So then you can go to the next slide. On this background, I asked 3 questions for food research, where I think there's a knowledge gap. The first will be to what extent alternative food networks represent effective solutions and whether they can provide innovative ideas. I think in order to answer this question, we have to admit that there's been an increase in online shopping or e-commerce, but at the same time, alternative food networks vary considerably among countries. In the Nordic countries, they constitute less than 5% of the market, perhaps closer to 2%, compared to 10% and more in the Southern European countries and Poland, for example. They play different roles. In some countries, they provide high-end quality products. In other countries, being an important provider of everyday food for a large section of the population. The next slide, please. The second question will be how alternative food networks and e-commerce will meet the effects of social distribution. In several countries, the pandemic has resulted in the highest unemployment rates since World War II. Many of these countries were already affected by an endemic and high unemployment, with very many people outside of the security net of welfare policies, such as in the UK and in Spain and in very many other Mediterranean countries. Consumer spending has dropped in most countries, poverty has increased, and this has resulted in a dramatic increase in food insecurity among families with small children. And there was a report from Eurochild that was published a couple of days ago that really demonstrated these severe effects. There has been an upswing of food charities, and once again, we see that alternative food networks have different roles. There has been criticism against alternative food networks, like, for example, Julia Guthman's criticism of alternative food networks in California, stating that they've traditionally addressed the urban affluent, and I think in some other countries you will find the same tendency, whereas being an important source of supply in countries like in Spain and Italy. So once again, we see that they play a different role and have different effects. Next slide, please. So the last question will be, what will be the response of the regime actors? The regime actors here defined as the public regulators, the food industry, and the retailers. On the one hand, we nearly everywhere have seen an outpouring of support for domestic and local producers. The crisis has indeed reinforced issues about social responsibility and about rallying around the flag. I mean, support for the local and the regional. In many countries, there has been increased subsidies for alternative networks. And in countries like in Norway, retailers introduced price support to increase their portfolio of local food producers and to attract them as suppliers. So there is an effort actually to integrate the alternative food providers into the conventional distribution system. On the other hand, we have seen digital platforms like Google, Amazon, and Facebook, and that have become stronger. That is something that Francesca already has mentioned. This means that local producers, in order to connect with the consumers through digital platforms, will depend on an even more powerful counterpart. And I think this raises some very fundamental questions, both when it comes to the retaining of the profit margin among the producers, and particularly among the small-scale producers, and also their ability to uphold their identity as an alternative to the conventional distribution system. I think that these are some of the questions that will need increased academic, but also public interest in the time to come. So I will thank you for the attention, and I'll be happy to respond to any of your comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this excellent introduction, which gives us some first hints for reflection. In order to remain in a general and global appreciation of these ongoing changes which affect food system, I will now give the floor to Anna Rapazzo to illustrate how e-commerce and food network are relevant in the developing world, and give account to how implication for food security and livelihood of workers and the role of the public sector. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Margherita, and thank you, Arne, because my reflections feed into your initial thoughts quite directly. So as I said, I would look more at the development world perspective and to the rural sector perspective, which is so crucial for the economies and the food systems of developing countries. And when Margherita asked me to contribute to this seminar, my first question, I had an uneasiness, no? And my first question, I realized that my question was, is these really relevant from my perspective? How can I contribute? Is e-commerce and food networks something relevant, or is it something that has the potential just in Western countries to have a more fair, equitable, and sustainable food systems? And I did some investigation, and long story short, the answer is definitely yes. E-commerce and food networks are definitely relevant. So I looked at the data, and the data say that e-commerce steadily grew throughout the last few years, and data confirm what common sense would suggest. Developing countries are, as you know, a very diverse group of countries with solid, robust economy and a growing urban population and middle class. So symmetrically to the Western explosion during the pandemic of food networks and solidarity networks, or more easily purchased channels facilitated through social networks and local communities, is also an increasing phenomenon in many countries. In the countries we would expect, big economies like India or Brazil or Chile or Mexico, but also in Africa and Southeast Asia, where digitalization is rapidly improving there. So the immense spread of cell phones in the last few years enabled that. With some specifics, I would say that this is mainly related, as I said, for the urban population, because for obvious reasons, the rural infrastructure and other factors, including, for instance, the existence of non-existence of a banking system that allows for electronic payments, for instance, or the mobility and infrastructure allowing for urban, peri-urban, and rural structural flow of commodities for this kind of networks is not necessarily a possibility for the countries. So my first question here is that research is needed, because there is a lot of evidence that suggests that this is indeed possibly beneficial for consumers and producers in rural areas and in developing countries, including the least developed countries, associated with the parallel digitalization process and access to technology and digitalization, but has to be tailored to the specific need and accompanied by structural support, which to a certain extent has happened during the pandemic, because FAO, for instance, worked together with the countries at global and regional level to evaluate the supply chain disruptions, because that was a big problem there, no? In flow of commodities, particularly how to bring the non-processed goods into the processing areas, particularly from developing to developed countries or to least developed of middle income countries. That's been, you know, e-commerce and mapping of stocks and production and monitoring of prices and access of the local medium and small scale business symmetrically to small and medium producers has seen a growing investments in infrastructure and things. So another sector which is potentially very promising in developing countries that was not referred by Arne, but I'm sure he has a lot of knowledge about that in Europe as well, is more in general on e-commerce, on agriculture machineries, inputs, and sectors. And that lowered the prices for small and medium farms, because the direct purchase of machineries and the direct intermediary organization for food commerce and e-commerce allowed for the small and medium scale enterprises and producers to also access niches, maybe for the time being, of the market that sustain their livelihood, and being those based on customary law and having the tendency more than in Western countries to be spread in terms of wealth across communities. This is something that collective access to prices, market, commercialization of products has helped, non-disrupting the food availability, and is conducive to a sustainable modernization of the agriculture sector. It needs to be complemented by, or again, other sources, because in countries where institutions are weak, concentration of power and structural inequalities tend to reverse quite rapidly positive effect into negative effects on food security and nutrition. The last trend, which is experienced, and I would like to talk about, is the increasing developing countries owned platform for food and agriculture trade. There are some, I'm thinking here of obvious countries that are developing that, like South Africa, with an advanced economy and infrastructure and research, etc. But emerging countries like Kenya that are really leading and paved the way for these kind of trade and commodities kind of arrangements, including e-commerce and localizing and targeting the local markets and national markets, is rapidly increasing as an opportunity. So short answer is e-commerce and food networks are indeed quite relevant for developing countries as well. And I get to my second question, which are the implications for food security, nutrition, the livelihood of workers? I already covered part of it. I will add only that looking at the food security side of the story, developing countries in the lower income countries in particular tend to be net importers of food and commodities, and heavily depend on neighboring migration and support for ensuring productivity and availability of food. So this pandemic has hit those countries very hard. And since the majority of the market segment for food purchase is processed food, there is not only, in addition to the trends that Arne mentioned, unemployment rates, economic slowdown, GDP decrease, that lower by definition the availability and affordability of food for the lower segments of the population, there is also a serious risk for increased obesity and overweight, having indirect and immediate consequences on health sectors and the health of the workers, etc. And the implications are also globally and regionally on the way the market is shaped, how is it organized, and who mediates this kind of market. And Arne again has mentioned that. I stopped there. So from here, I have more questions than answers, actually, and I hope we can discuss that. because I get to my last question, which is from a governance point of view, going back to my governance strong background and interest. I think there is an opportunity to have this debate and to have research growing and evidence producing various levels, for policy advice, to document and to do things, because there is a shift in the public discourse around few issues that to me are interesting, because the way the public discourse and the priorities are named also influences the capacity and the actionability of the policy and governance agendas around these issues. The first shift is that for many years we've been speaking about the importance of markets to regulate some of the services. This pandemic reminded all of us that the public is the one with the responsibility to ensure food security, food safety, safety of the people, and to allow for all the people to access the basic services and fulfill the obligation of the right holders to get health, nutrition, school, etc. So for the first time after many years, the intergovernmental and international development community is speaking again about political world governing economy and not the other way around, which is a great opportunity and a great challenge, because the political discourse can be quickly hijacked and greenwashed in so many ways. The second shift is the re-emerging of local and national actors versus global markets and regional markets. So big business, the small business is back into the picture, because it was evident how the local market and the regional markets were essential to compensate the global supply chain disruptions, and was essential to invest in social security for the workers to allow the whole population to recover after the pandemic. So local markets are back, producers are back. There was in Italy an enormous debate on ensuring that migrants in the agriculture sector had expedited visa procedures to allow the local production to make fresh food available in the households. And this is something that was a niche discussion among practitioners and consumers, but not at the scale that has happened now. So how do we keep these issues high in the agenda? How do we back up with the research? And I would conclude with few positive thoughts related to things that are happening in the global governance world. No, this requires those issues translate, and again, the research can have a big role in those issues to be translated into global governance and policy decisions. The Codex Alimentarius has already, for instance, a lot of regulations and voluntary guidelines on food safety, which have been rediscussed for e-commerce and food networks and local markets to improve, on one hand, the trust of the consumers for e-commerce of food, and on the other side, to allow for the local production and sovereignty of the countries in the production, in the availability and policies of food, while non-disrupting, not having negative effects on others. And lastly, the Food Systems Summit has a big chunk of discussion on innovation and digitalization. So again, there is a lot of space in the action tracks. There are national and independent dialogues, food system dialogues that are being organized and are directly feeding into the global discussion that will happen in the Food Systems Summit in September, that allow to keep up these debates and for the research and academic community to contribute to shaping these discussions in the next few years. Over to you, Margherita.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving us this general framework and how the pandemics has reshaped partially and reintroduced in the agenda actors and governance level that before were more blurred, let's say. So just going to the other end of the governance level, I give the floor to Jordan Trickle, who will address how the COVID pandemics has influenced in local food systems and alternative food networks, especially from the small-scale farmers' point of view. Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you, Margherita. So I just want to preface my intervention today saying that NFFC is not a research organization or a technical service provider. We do policy advocacy. And so the insights I'm going to provide today are from our farmer members' lived experience as they're relayed to us at the organizational level, rather than scientific research. I'm not going to use a PowerPoint today, but I am going to try to drop a few links in the chat as I go along so that you all can sort of see the framing of our work and how we talk about these issues. This first link I'm dropping is a link to the statement that we put out about a year ago as COVID was starting to hit the US and we were trying to organize a response. So I want to focus most of my time today talking about how COVID has impacted the food system and how this framing is likely to shape the emerging e-commerce sector, particularly for small-scale producers. So COVID-19 has had two significant impacts on the U.S. food system. And they're significant not because they're unique or unexpected. They're very much in line with the points that Arne and Anna have already touched on. But they're significant because they have really clearly illuminated to the general American public the fragility of the corporate food value chains and the relative resilience of our local food systems. The emerging e-commerce sector, I think, is likely to amplify both of these dynamics that we've seen during COVID. But I think just to start, I'd like to acknowledge that COVID-19 has had significant impacts on food insecurity or for food security in the U.S. It's caused a lot of suffering, and those impacts have disproportionately impacted communities of color and marginalized groups in the U.S. Before the pandemic, food insecurity in the U.S. was around 10% in 2019. But by 2020, food insecurity in households with children had reached nearly 30% in June of last year. And the private and nonprofit, the charitable anti-hunger programs, such as food banks, as we call them in the U.S., were overrun. There was a lot of news media showing lines, kilometers, miles long of people lining up for food. And this is quite shocking for many folks who don't work in the food sector. So there's really quite clearly some fundamental food security problems in the U.S. in terms of ensuring the right to food for all people here. On the production side, farm debt is also at a historic high in the U.S. 90% of farms in this country are classified by the government as small scale. And according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, between 60 and 80% of those small-scale farmers are at high financial risk for foreclosure as of December 2020. So these dynamics are not new, and they're a clear indication that agricultural markets have not been delivering fair prices for family-scale producers for a long time, and there is an urgent need for reform. So that's all to say that from both a farmer and an eater perspective, COVID-19 has really exacerbated some fundamental problems in the U.S. food system. But to focus a little bit more about how the food system has been impacted by COVID-19, I'd like to highlight two key dynamics. The first is that the most highly concentrated commodity value chains basically temporarily collapsed in the first half of 2020 in the U.S. Processing and distribution centers and large-scale farms that were dependent on low-wage workers and farm laborers did not adapt to the public health crisis. The infrastructure and equipment to keep workers healthy and ensure these centers were functioning just wasn't in place. And we saw thousands of workers across the country get sick and die because of these failures. Most disturbingly, we saw the former Trump administration, in coordination with corporate agribusiness, really exacerbate the problem. In 2020, instead of mandating national protocols to compensate food system workers for the risks to their health and ensuring that these workers had proper equipment, we saw the Trump administration use the federal government to force meat processing centers to stay open in violation of, we believe, of labor rights. And in turn, we saw meat processing plants become some of the worst impacted hotspots for COVID in the nation. And this tragedy hasn't been accounted for. So it's in the context of these failures of industrial food production, processing, distribution, that we're also seeing large institutions like schools close, which has already been mentioned. And as an aside, schools in the U.S., as in many other countries, are a key player in delivering subsidized meals to children, and so they play an important role in preventing food insecurity in the U.S. So there was this fairly sudden transition of institutional markets closing, and all of that consumer demand shifted to the retail sector. But the processors and distribution centers that previously sold to institutions largely could not switch to retail. And there's a number of sort of mechanical and logistical constraints that prevented that adaptation, which I won't go into. But this all means that agricultural production, particularly of commodities like dairy, meat, and poultry, and other food crops from large-scale vegetable production, simply didn't leave the farm because of these food distribution and processing failures, and to some extent due to the closure of institutional markets. So many farmers, particularly large-scale producers, were forced to destroy crops on the farm because they weren't getting picked up and farmers weren't getting paid for it, for these crops. So for example, NFFC has a large dairy farmer constituency in our network, and in May 2020, 3.7 million gallons of milk were being dumped per day in the US. So this dynamic really highlights the common phrase that is often heard from civil society organizations working towards food sovereignty globally, that food insecurity is driven less by lack of production and more by lack of access. And we know that food access involves issues of power, and particularly economic power, and the governance of food systems. And in the US, we see a handful of corporations holding concentrated and centralized power in our food system. The second significant dynamic I want to highlight is how local food systems or alternative food networks respond to the pandemic. In the spring of 2020, we saw a huge surge in demand for local foods produced by our farmer members. Local farmers markets, community supported agriculture boxes, and other direct producer to consumer marketing did well for a short amount of time. And most farmers who were already doing direct consumer sales before the pandemic were able to meet that demand. And in some cases, demand very much surpassed supply. It's understandable that many small-scale producers cannot or do not want to scale up overnight, knowing that demand may not be long-term. But the challenging market dynamics of restaurants and schools continuing to be operating not at full capacity for more than a year now continues to leave these direct market producers in a financially precarious position. I'll just note that there was a bit of uncertainty on whether local farmers markets would be able to stay open during the pandemic. And during this moment of uncertainty, many direct sales producers shifted from selling in local markets to a direct CSA model, which obviously required a number of investments, and not all small-scale producers were able to make those kinds of investments. But we did not see local markets as being a site of COVID transmission. So the main takeaway here is that local food producers, particularly direct market farmers, were much more resilient and adaptive on a whole to the pandemic. But those with some e-commerce online infrastructure, when coupled with the material resources to do more CSA model distribution, seem to do best. I'm running out of time, so I was going to go into the policy response by the U.S. government, and I'm just going to go through that quickly. There were three main programs that I want to touch on. The first was something called the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, which was the main program that was providing direct payments to producers for loss of market access. And there's a number of criticisms of that program, mainly that the government was compensating producers not on lost revenue, but on scale of production. And so that really exacerbated many of the inequities in production in the U.S. And it was a significant amount of money went into that program, more than $23 billion in 2020. I can go into those details of that program more in the question and answer, but I will drop a link in the chat here of our main concerns. The second program was institutional purchasing by the government, basically trying to buy up this access production that wasn't getting off of farms and distributing that to the anti-hunger charitable food sector. And again, we saw that the challenges that larger scale production, larger scale farms were prioritized by that program, leaving a lot of small scale producers out of that program. And then the third program I want to mention, so just to highlight that those two core programs did not focus on e-commerce. The main public response was not involving e-commerce, but there was a third program I'm just going to touch on called the SNAP Online Purchasing Pilot, which was actually authorized in law in 2014 and had just started at the beginning of 2019 in one state in the U.S., so one subnational government. And this program focuses on food insecure households receive funding to be able to buy food, typically not online, and these are called SNAP benefits. And the SNAP system accounts for more than 75% of all agri-food system spending by the federal government in the U.S. And at the beginning of 2019, there was this pilot program of expanding this anti-hunger program to online sales. And over the course of 2020, this program was really ramped up. And today we see 47 states, almost the entire country, have signed up for this initiative, although not all states are yet operational. But the important thing to note here is that the companies that are participating in this pilot are the biggest corporate retailers in the country. So Aldi, Amazon, and Walmart are three of those core companies. And those companies were not prioritizing small-scale producers in their value chains before the pandemic and before this pilot program. And so there's no evidence, although it's still a pilot program and there's not a whole lot of public information about the implementation of the program, we don't really have any reason to believe that is suddenly going to be a public program that really benefits small-scale producers in the U.S. So I know I'm running out of time, so I just want to conclude here by saying COVID-19 had a significant impact on the U.S. food system and really demonstrated both the resilience of local and alternative food networks and the fragility of the corporate food sector. We did see some progress in terms of forward-thinking policy proposals that have tried to address the longstanding social and economic inequities in the U.S. I didn't get a chance to talk about those, but happy to talk about them in the question and answer. But mostly we saw the U.S. federal government throw a lot of public funding at the problems that we see in the U.S., but without a lot of policy reforms that address the systemic challenges that we see. So those structural problems really remain, and we have concerns that these e-commerce platforms that are supported by public funding are going to exacerbate those problems if major changes aren't done to support small-scale producers being included in those value chains. So apologies, Margarita, for going over time. I'll give it back to you.
Thank you very much, Jordan, for sharing the appalling situation that the COVID created in the US. And also, I guess also not only for me, but for everybody who's attending this seminar, like question and reasoning are building in our head, and we will keep until the last presentation to then talk and share our thoughts. So I will now give the floor to Vipul Chatterjee, who has the viewpoint of consumers in India. So Vipul, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margarita. Thank you. Thanks to other speakers for placing their thoughts on the table. The situation in India is very much different from many other parts of the region of the world. You see, our food security system is highly localized, I would say. At the same time, we see that food availability is dependent on various sources, but largely from within the country, at least the basic food items like rice and wheat, and also pulses nowadays. Now, this is very interesting because there are a number of challenges, lacunas, shortcomings in the system. But at the same time, we have seen that during this pandemic time, over the last 1 year or so, actually, this is the system which has saved lives of millions and millions of people in our country. We have our National Food Security Act, which covers more than 800 million people, not just the poor, but also those who are slightly above poverty. And they are primarily, they access their food either free of cost. During this pandemic period, for several months, poor families were given food, the grain in particular, free of cost or at a very little cost. Now, that's one part of the story. What we have seen during this pandemic, since this was a kind of a supply side shock, which we witnessed. But in terms of food availability, there was hardly any problem in our country. Of course, the logistics were arranged, but we have to also see the other side of the story, that people should have the purchasing power to access, to buy food, even if it is largely supplied at a very low price. So that purchasing power was also ensured largely, through the direct benefit transfer mechanism which we have developed over the last few years. So we have, even for the poorest of the poor, we have bank accounts where you can directly transfer money, which the government has done, except in few cases, largely it is successful. And it has also helped us to reduce the leakages in the system. Of course, some deserving people also got left out as a result of mismatch of data and things like that. There's a case pending before the Supreme Court of India. And I'm sure that the government is going to take that into account and address that anomaly. So even if everything came to a halt during this lockdown period in particular, our food security system didn't face much of a difficulty because of the localized nature. We have public distribution system, we have local shops in our neighborhood because of the localized nature of distribution of food grains in particular. Now, I'm talking about basic food items. Of course, there are other items which are much more important, not just from the point of view of food security, but also from the point of view of nutrition security. Now, as we see that our purchasing power is getting increased, of course, pandemic has made a dent to it, and we hope to see to it that we make a comeback as soon as possible. Demand for food items other than basic items, that is also increasing. And there again, we see there are a number of local networks of producers as well as consumers, which are emerging and which is actually helping both sides of the story, of the equation, both local producers and local consumers to access food items, including items like milk, eggs, and other nutritious fruits, vegetables at a lower price as compared to what it used to be in the recent past. Here, I would particularly like to mention one network which is doing, in my opinion, which is doing wonderful work, and that is in southern India, in few states in southern India, which is known as Millet Sisters Network, which is established and run by women members of the households. Their focus is on millets, coarse grains. As you know, that particular area is water-starved, and millets are largely produced in those areas, and they are highly nutritious. And we see that similar networks are emerging in various other parts of the country for the producers as well as consumers. I mean, in a country like India, where agriculture is very diffused, I would say, with average landholding is just about less than a hectare, I would say, not even a hectare, where those who are producing food items, whether it is grains or vegetables, definitely they cannot sustain themselves by their own produce. So they have to also buy. Producers, the distinction between producer and consumers is largely speaking is not there. So producers are also consumers are also producers. So we have to look at both sides of the story in order to see how they are interacting with each other in order to have a much more robust food security system in our country. And in that context, there's a relatively new development, I would say, which is emerging, that in every part of the country, these farmer producer organizations are coming up, which is essentially cooperatives, farmer cooperatives. KUTS is also, and the responsibility has been given to civil society organizations like us to help farmers to establish these organizations, these cooperatives. In fact, KUTS has already established 2 of them in Rajasthan state of India, and we have now got the responsibility of establish about 12 more farmer producer organizations. Now, since they have come together, they are having better access to inputs, better marketing, and now they're also very much interested in getting into the value addition of their products. And there comes the role of electronic commerce. So many of these FPOs, farmer producer organizations, they are now getting linked with big companies, including companies like Walmart and others, ITC, Reliance. So these companies, they are also into the food business. So these companies are sourcing many of their products from these FPOs, farmers who are members of these cooperatives. So what would be the impact of local food availability as a result of that? That's something which we need to look into. Since this is very new, it's just about 2, 3, 5 years max. Now it is being scaled up. So that is something which we need to see, that how, whether while farmers are going to get better price, that's for sure. Consumers at large, they are going to have better access. That's also very much there. And these organizations are also working on, they are into B2B as well as B2C e-commerce. Some of them are doing very well. But what would be the impact on local food security at the household level, particularly for the poor who are having access to grains, but what about other food items? That is something which we need to look at much more carefully. So overall, I think the system which we have developed over the years, from a food deficit country, now a largely surplus country, though there are still issues related to access, issues related to hunger, but now we are in a much better position to serve our population, at least with basic food grains. Now, as purchasing power is increasing with more items like milk, vegetables, the demand for such items are also increasing. So overall, in that sense, food security wise, we are doing well. But when it comes to safety, food safety or quality, I would say, I think there is a long way to go. That's something which, again, we are working on. Since we are working on organic farming, we are also part of the food, part of the Committee on the Food Safety and Standards Institute of India. So the challenge, I would say, is to ensure better quality food at an affordable price, not just for those who have better purchasing power, but at a larger scale, including those who comes under this National Food Security Act. And maybe the scope of this act, we have to also take a relook to include more number, at least, let's say, 1,000 million or 1 billion people, not households, definitely not. Then I think it will be, we can be more sure about food security situation in our country. So I will conclude by saying that overall, our system is quite robust, and this is tested during this pandemic, particularly during the lockdown period. Now it is time to do more to prevent leakages in the system, and also to see to it that our people get more nutritious food at an affordable price. I'll end here. I'm looking forward to your questions or clarifications. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vipul. And now I give the floor to Francesca for the last presentation. Thank you, Francesca.
Okay, I will help myself with the presentation, also to try to keep the time. I will also put my timer. So I don't know if you share my same feeling after all this presentation that we have traveled around the world. That is a quite a funny situation since we are locked in and without being able to travel for. So I think that thank you very much for all the presentation because really I enjoyed. And I think that some of the things that I will talk about speaks especially to what Jordan and Bipul have, and of course Arne have talked about in earlier in their speech. Well, what I tried to do while preparing for today is to try to combine 3 lines of research that we have carried on at the COACT research group. One is on alternative food network, but looking at this alternative food network from the consumer point of view, considering alternative food network as a new kind of food movement. Then I will give you some first reflection based on data that we have collected within the platform project that I introduced earlier on. Again, looking at from the consumer point of view, from the consumer side, and then I will try to think about together with you how can we interview on these processes in order to make them becoming more inclusive, because also Anna has stressed the fact that these alternative food networks are usually targeting or are able to activate mainly affluent or middle classes consumers. So this is a kind of limitation that we can all observe, together with a lot of interesting things that I have brought in the debate around food. What are we talking about? We are talking about some sort of solution to challenge the challenges brought to by the conventional food system. We haven't remembered in the earlier talk that our food system is responsible for 25–30% of the CO2 emission from loss of biodiversity. We have mentioned the problem with the hunger versus obesity, but we have also the paradox to produce often food that became fuel for transportation for producing energy. Or we have this problem of 1/3 of food that is globally produced that goes waste every year. So there is obviously some problem in this conventional food system. Before going to try to answer the 3 questions that I gave to myself for this talk about the learning opportunity within digital alternative food system and how and if these new technologies offer opportunity for the development of alternative food networks, and who should direct this development, I would like to go a little bit in detail of what are these alternative food networks and why they emerge. Here there are some fundamental issues that are into the debate of alternative food network. Obviously, people who engage in these from the consumer point of view, but also from the producer point of view in this network, search to reduce their carbon footprint. They look for better quality of food. For good food, that doesn't mean that tastes good or better than ordinary food, but is good also for the environment. They, of course, sign the loss of trust in conventional food system, but they are also looking for establishing new connection between producer and consumer, and among citizens, among consumer or among producer itself. Because if we think about contemporary society, we see clearly that is based on this connection between consumer and producer, but also this connection between consumer and nature, this connection, but also if we want desynchronization, I mean, people are not able to recognize seasonality of food, for example. This is a part of the story of the unsustainability part of the conventional food system. So what happened within this network? That is true. I mean, are limited to a group of people, not necessarily affluent, very affluent people, but surely with a higher level of education, at least this data, the data we have collected and all over the world sign these, but they have been able to put again food in the agenda of the public debate, thinking about food and politicizing food, as someone has mentioned before. But I've been able also to reskill, to provide more new skills to citizens, because if you think about the rise of ready-made food and which kind of consequences has these on habits, healthy habits, but also sustainable diet. And also what Alternative Food Network are doing or they actually increasing the accessibility of good food to consumer. For example, constructing and building new infrastructure. For example, the Solidarity Purchase Group that with my group of research we have studied quite a lot for a long time. They are actually new infrastructure. They are not just a group of consumers. They build a new infrastructure to make food, local food, organic food more accessible to citizens. In fact, for example, if we look at the different Alternative Food Network, we can see that, for example, Gasistas, member of this Solidarity Purchase Group, are not so affluent as in other networks. So they actually are able to enlarge and make this food more accessible to not so well-off consumer. But what do this network is also something very interesting, because reconnecting producer and consumer, but reconnecting also people together, consumer together, and also consumer together, they are quite effective also to change our diet, people's diets, towards a more sustainable, what now in the debate is called a sustainable diet. Here we underline the percentage of people that question beyond this statistic, where what has changed on your consumption habits since you have joined a Solidarity Purchasing Group. And beside the 80% that say that we increase the consumption of local food, there is also 42.5% that declare that they decrease the consumption of meat. So I think that the core learning effect within these groups is quite interesting. Somehow it reminds what a very important theory regarding consumption. I mean, one of the main theory going on in consumption studies today, saying that in order to change, to transit, to transport citizen consumption toward a more sustainable diet or our habits, you have to work on three directions, not just give information to consumer, but also reskilling them, but also change the materiality around them. That if we think is exactly what Alternative Food Network do. They inform their system of information, they reskill, they, for example, exchange ideas and knowledge about vegetable. I mean, consumer used to consume few type of vegetable and losing, I mean, being part in cause of the loss of biodiversity, but they also change the infrastructure. So this is the second part of the insights that I wanted to provide with this talk. And what happened? We have seen that digital online food network has increased, and somehow, for example, as Jordan mentioned, help local producer to reach local consumer. And we went into this network, the digital network, to understand what consumer were doing inside here, and if this digital network maintains somehow the capacity of co-learning effects that physical Alternative Food Network had. And actually, there's something very interesting going on here. We interview in Milan 45 people that say that actually this platform helped them to planning more, to get access to more to food that is more variegate, to reconnect the season with seasonality, to also recognize the limits of nature. There are some nice stories that I don't have time to go in, but food ends, and they discover in this platform that food has a limit, an end. And this platform have been also able to extend the number of consumers that can access good food. There are also some disadvantages that we collected among consumers, that, for example, the costing crisis, because of course there is an intermediation here that has been created. And there is less co-learning effect, because sometimes we shop, we go already there with some idea, we shop, we do what we had in mind. Although also for consumer, there are positive facts, but also negative one, like for example, producer, as it was said also before, had a greater possibility to reach the local consumer. That was very important during the pandemic. But there is also a decrease of gain because of this kind of new intermediation. We studied also which type of platform or platform design are better to maintain these co-learning effects on the part of the consumer. I don't have time to go here a lot of in detail, but this is a quite interesting finding, also because it can have practical effect. There are some platforms, for example, that maintain a lot of much more capacity of co-learning effect than others. For example, what is called the food assembly platform, that are digital online platforms that maintain the possibility for consumer to producer to meet, or again, the platform that are initiated to grassroots organization, like the platform that is an online platform that are directing evolution of solidarity purchasing group. But then, what is this? Who should direct this phenomenon in order to make it more inclusive? And here comes the third part of the small insights that I want to provide, also to open up the discussion. There is a lot of going on in the discussion on alternative food network that they have a lot of shortcomings. They can be elitist, as we said before. They can be captured easily from market players that destroy actually all what they try to construct. But they can also remain a niche market. And here comes the third and last part of the story. There is a lot of going on at the level of the local municipality, in order to try, and there is also a lot of work between an increasing working together of this food movement, new food movement with local municipality, in an attempt that we have level of scaling through local government, local municipality. And here the last initiative that I would like to present is this interesting pact, that is the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, that was initiated in Milan in 2015 and has nowadays involved a lot of towns around the world, actually underline that we need, if we want to achieve a real environmental transition in the food sector, we need local actors and especially municipality to play a role in reconnecting producer and consumption and consumer, but also in ensuring the fact that these phenomena are really inclusive, like, for example, working with developing sustainable dietary guidelines, reorienting school feeding program, etc., etc. Here are just extracts from the protocol developed within the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact. And here are just few pictures of what we are doing in Trento. Our effort of as a research group is learning from our research, but also trying to feed our own territory, the place where we work, the city of Trento, in order to try to work together some line of intervention that can help people to access, all people to access food that is sustainable for the nature, but also for people, so social, economic, and environmental sustainable. I don't have time here to go on because I already overcome my time, but here are some links that are, I guess, interesting also to go a bit deeper on this issue that I try to quickly rise in this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and thank again to everybody for these excellent presentations. So maybe we have the feeling that we were exposed to such different viewpoints and geographical experiences and governance level, but actually I think that's it is really the diversity of intervention that helped, at least myself, elaborating some insight, some thought. And so from this, and we had three layers. We had the COVID pandemic, we had alternative food networks and local food systems, and e-commerce. And what emerged is that, okay, COVID-19 pandemics has constituted a shock, as we well know, and also highlighted the importance of local food system, and also raised attention on the occasion, let's say, for consumers to rethink the consumption pattern to some extent, but also weakened and make more vulnerable other categories. So what emerged is that e-commerce is a tool, is an instrument that sometimes complements and sometimes supplements existing and pre-existing food arrangement, food networks, and it is therefore important to keep looking at those two different phenomena together, because e-commerce is not a separate market. It builds on what's existing, and it is therefore very important to take this into consideration, the pre-existing situation, in order to shape, let's say, orient this instrument, use this instrument in a way to deliver sustainable food system and deliver food security. So e-commerce, we have seen, it can facilitate reaching food security, but it can also exclude, like be an instrument of exclusion, as we have seen, if there is a power capture of the tool, if for example, exactly, big corporation let's say occupy all the space, or even, and worse, if a public policy design the instrument without including small-scale farmers and networks. Therefore, indeed, it is important that the tool is carefully tailored, as Anna was saying, in order to fit the context, the local context. And also, what emerged is the importance of different actors at different level. Okay, the associations are crucial actors to facilitate, like consumers and producer organizations are crucial in order to contribute shaping and tailoring this instrument as in an appropriate way, let's say, but also organization of producers, like more traditional ones like cooperatives and producer organization, has to play a role in channeling and strengthening the position of those which are more vulnerable in the food chain, and also institutions, especially local level institution has a very big part in this play, but we also seen that without a more general regulatory framework that recognize that has the sensitivity to uphold, to promote several like networks, like sustainable food networks. Also, the good intention of local institution is hampered by, let's say, higher level structural limits. Therefore, I think that having this very broad set of experiences really helped thinking and reminding the system and e-commerce as plays in a way broader landscape. So I have question, but I hold it because I want to give the floor to the audience that patiently remained. So please, I encourage participants to open their microphone and webcams and presenting themselves and sharing their answer. I encourage to be let's say concise in the questions in order to allow the more questions possible to be raised, and also encourage the panelists to ask questions, to pose questions to the others. So I can, let's see how many questions are there. I think we will start by taking one question and letting the panelists answers, and then let's see how it goes. Alice, please.
So hello, and thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. So just a bit of two questions really, because maybe we are very much into, or at least starting to understand the dynamics of the diffusion of the birth and diffusion of online markets for food in the global north. But personally, I know much less about the developing south. And as it was mentioned that anyway, this is a growing the sphere of food exchange and food commerce. I just wanted to know who are the actors involved, mainly where these experiences come from, and whether they tend to be grassroots or maybe market driven, business driven. And then a question to Bipul. Just out of complete ignorance, I mean, we have seen also lately the capacity for mobilization, for example, by farmers in India in this period as well. And I wanted to know whether there is something comparable, or at least anyway there is a power of mobilization as well on the issue of consumption, and so for example access to food security, etc. And yeah, that's it.
I answered this question. Yes, the consumers also, they have the mobilization power, but that is, I would say, very much decentralized in our country. It's not like that they're going to come to Delhi and do all sorts of things. So it's very much decentralized, and we have seen it in the past. Whenever there is a sudden increase in the price of a particular commodity, a commodity of mass consumption, let's say, food items, then consumers, they do come together, and it's politically also very, very sensitive, particularly the consumer price inflation of food items. So they may not be that visible, but they may not get the Western press. But that doesn't mean that consumers are not mobilized enough to demand for availability of food items at affordable price, or access to food at affordable price. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I can address the other question. And likewise, the Western northern countries, the situation of actors is very diverse across the so-called G77. The developing countries plus China call themselves the G77 originally. They negotiate together as a bloc, but they're not a bloc. So in terms of e-commerce and food networks, there are diversity. So in Latin America and Asia in particular, food e-commerce, both at international scale with intermediaries making commodities available through the net, as well as collective efforts to link market, urban market and consumers can be more or less compared to the northern countries. So the actors are the same, and the Milan Pact that was mentioned by Francesca has reached a critical number of developing cities, not only in Brazil, India, or relatively, modern urban centers, but also developing countries centered like Dar es Salaam or Arusha in Tanzania, and so on and so forth. So the magnitude of the informal networks, urban, peri-urban, is not as big as in Germany, I would say. It's common sense. There is a big portion of regionally owned and nationally owned platform for the kind of e-commerce related to machinery and inputs that was also heavily financed to avoid the disruption in the supply value chain. Inter-regional commerce was very much of an issue, and closing borders even within regions was problematic. So the interventions that were made with in the international community, with the strong support of strong economies like India, China, and Argentina, Chile, etc., prevented more serious disruption in the flow of seeds for the planting season in Africa, for harvest, so migration of workers. So there, the interlinkages put together by the net through e-commerce of that was planned together with the international organizations that supported the regulation of the market by the international and regional governance platforms. Their governance is meant as institutional, so the WTO discussing the patents of the drugs of COVID, but also how the commodities were taxed. Certain subsidies and incentives were authorized that were in principle against the international law, and there were some interventions regionally, pooling together stocks, making the commodities available, and their flow of commodities orders and also price regulation to avoid inequalities in the purchase, demand and offer power was also a big part of it. I don't know if I replied to your question, but just to give you an idea of the phenomenon there.
Thank you very much. I just see that people will have to leave soon, as well as Anna. So, just in case Hannah really has to leave, I thank her so very much to make time to be there. And also, I would like to give the floor to Ashem, please.
Hi, Margarita. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I'm Shadi Hashim from the Shadi Hashim from the Irish platforms teams. First, I would like to thank you all, especially Arnie and Francesca and Margherita, of course, and the international panel for this successful event. Very fruitful, very insightful. I have two main questions that are not necessarily platform-related questions, but they are more into what Anna, hopefully she's still here, and Jordan, Bipul as well, he can add into that and just provide some insight regarding the what Anna spoke about regarding the public after COVID. They realized the importance of reclaiming the market powers from the hands of the private. So if you could just elaborate more, how would you think the public sector, who have willingly give up the power a long time ago to the private sector to govern the market, would reclaim their powers, given the dominance of the private sector in the market in terms of their capital and access to everything? The second question would be more related to still like the public intervention. So for instance, Jordan spoke of the US government intervention amid COVID pandemic to somehow reframe policies in order to provide subsidies for producers who have been affected by the pandemic, but not necessarily benefiting those small producers due to maybe the imbalance or the inequity within the agri-food supply chain. So again, how would the public, intervene in a beneficial way, given that all what we see from government, especially in the global north, is subsidies. So if they are trying to reform the market and just overcome the market failure, the first answer is, well, we give up subsidies to farmers, which are not very helpful on the long run in terms of sustainability and food security, food sovereignty. The last question would be the impact of that on consumption. So how would consumers, especially the poor consumers, and I think Bipul spoke of that, poor consumers' access to products, and how would they be affected by these new maybe regulations or standards? So thank you. That'd be all.
Thank you. I will give the floor to Anna first, because maybe she has to go
unfortunately, I have a meeting with one of the countries I'm working on at 3:30. So I already said I might be a few minutes, but few minutes cannot be more than 5. Unfortunately, I'm very sad because it's very interesting. I think your question to me is about how we keep these public concerns alive. No, to me, this is, I would say, I said that this shifted, but I forgot to mention the biggest shift, because the analysis, the data, the narrative was from virtual economy back to real economy. That's how this happened to me. For many years, the growth, the impact of policies, interventions, etc., were fictional. Curves, economic analysis, which is absolutely fundamental, but we know that science has bias as well as any other discipline made by a human. So this is associated with an asymmetry of power in the governance at global, regional, and national level. So now that we are back to a debate, I wouldn't say that we need to tackle in the polarized, politicized discussion between who owns the big power in the market and who has nothing, because that doesn't go very far. What I'm saying is that this is an opportunity, because for the first time, the public was called with recovery bills and acts to operate to sustain the ones who have been traditionally powerless and voiceless. So to a certain extent, I'm calling to occupy that space and use that space. What Jordan was saying is that that pilot program that was not originally targeting a certain group and a certain e-commerce and in the pandemic multiplied because the importance of it for the public officials was made by the pressure of needs of the citizens. So missing links between how a farmer can be poor and then good food not be available for the lower segment of society. These links were made in the public discourse. So how do we keep this space open? So more than how it was possible that the politics didn't address that, how do we use this space of power we have as citizens, as researchers, as modelers, to make this research on real economy with the actors at the center for public policies that sustain equity and equality of these processes, including e-commerce, and in the broader context that Margherita was making, how we make it possible. I don't have the answer. I have questions that we know guide the action if well shaped. Sorry again, but I really need to leave, and I will stay another minute and then disconnect. I'm sorry, and to be
Thank
continued.
you so much, Anna. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Anna.
So maybe I can give the floor to Bipul to.
Thank you. Answering this question, you see, those who are extremely poor, their first priority is to have food. They're not much bothered about food safety. That doesn't mean that we should supply bad quality food items to them. Of course, we intend to supply always good quality items through the public distribution system, and largely, broadly speaking, it is working very well. Now, this system is in the public sector. So when you talk about basic food items like rice and wheat, which are the staple food in our country, they are largely in the public sector for the vast majority of our consumers, and of course for many others, we can also buy from the market. It's very much available. Now, when we talk about, this is one important item, food safety. It's not just part of the consumer's right to safety, but also it is linked with sustainable right to sustainable consumption, so as to say. Now, while the United Nations guidelines, that talks about sustainable consumption, and the definition is there quite clear, without much harm to environment and things like that. When it comes to our national regime, the Consumer Protection Act is still Consumer Protection Act, not Consumer Welfare Act. So this is something which we are lobbying with the government to have an amended section to include right to sustainable consumption, which is also linked with various other emerging areas in developing countries, including developing countries like us, like circular economy, like eco-mark, which is environmental eco-leveling, so as to say. So all these things have to be looked at in a holistic manner. And the good news is that consumers at all levels, I would say, they are becoming more and more aware about these issues. And as we see that the willingness to pay for more safe, more sustainable food items is also increasing, and that is across the board, I would say, of consumers. Of course, it is relative in the sense that very poor consumers, they are willing to pay slightly more than what they're paying. As compared to rich consumers, they are also willing to pay much more than what they're paying. But overall, I think the food security situation, as I said in the past, in the beginning, in India has improved substantially. But we have to now move from there to nutrition security and food fortification is a big agenda item, which is already where we are putting more nutrition into wheat, into rice. Food fortification is going to be very, very important for our nutrition security. So let me also take this opportunity to thank all of you for this wonderful session. So many things to learn, and hopefully we'll be in touch as we move forward, as we get into the, if I don't know whether I can say this, in a post-pandemic world, whether the post has already arrived or not.
Yeah.
But food security is going to be a very, very important pillar for a much more resilient post-pandemic world as compared to what it was or what it is still. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I have to leave now. Thanks, Margarita. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Arna. Nice to see you after a long time. Let's be in touch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah. Sorry. I would like to give Jordan the possibility to react to Shadi's question, and then probably will lead to the end. But Jordan, please.
Thank you, Margarita. I appreciate the questions. They're obviously really big questions, and we don't have time to do them justice with the complete response. But just a few quick thoughts. You know, when we talk about reclaiming power over this free market system, I think it's worth mentioning that over the course of 2020, we at NFFC were seeing all of these challenges unfold in the U.S. context, and we were also involved in the negotiations around the food system nutrition guidelines in the CFS in 2020, because we recognize that you know, as we deal with these challenges in the national context, the U.S. as one of many export-oriented countries, you know, our domestic policies have important impacts on how these challenges are addressed in the global South and developing world context. And we were quite dismayed to see the U.S. government really undercut the ambition of those guidelines and fail to sort of speak to the moment of this COVID context. And I won't get into the details of it, but just to say that I think that two pieces of the response of how we reclaim market power is ensuring that these public policies, either at the national or international levels, are rights-based. And that there's key pieces of participatory governance. And so ensuring that producers and consumers from vulnerable communities are actually in the process of developing policies. I don't think there can be anything that can be replaced to have those voices at the table. You mentioned subsidies, and that's a complicated subject. Our members feel that subsidies are imperfect, but they do provide a safety net for small-scale producers who are the most vulnerable, and just removing them without replacing a different system would most likely hurt the smallest producers who do receive subsidies the most. And so the approach that our organization has for decades proposed is using public policy to ensure fair prices for producers in the marketplace. And those fair prices need to reflect the scale for the cost of production at scale. And then using public policy to decentralize corporate control of our food system through things like antitrust. And a lot of these issues aren't new. You know, during the early 20th century, we had these programs in place coming out of the New Deal around the World War II period, and it was a series of decades where those programs were slowly chipped away at in favor of this more market-based system. And there is a growing conversation in the U.S. about reviving some of those programs from 100 years ago to address the high levels of concentration in the marketplace in the U.S. like it was a century ago. And then the last thing I'll just mention is that we didn't get into a whole lot of details about public procurement and direct payments. Our main concerns with the direct payment programs during COVID was that they didn't recognize or incentivize producers to do organic or bio or agroecology practices. They really treated those sustainable producers equally to conventional producers, and which basically means it put those sustainable producers at a disadvantage. And so we feel that, you know, when the public institutions are using public funding to procure food for folks who are food insecure, which is important, and this is the way that we ensure that these, you know, sustainably produced foods are not a niche market only for higher income households, that those programs need to include social and ecological indicators and objectives. They shouldn't just be based around economic efficiency criteria, which benefits the largest scale producers. So we did not see that in the COVID response of the Trump administration last year. We made some progress, but overall, those programs failed, and they have been suspended by the new Biden administration. So we continue to push for those reforms, but those are just a few quick thoughts to you, Margarita.
Thank you very much, Jordan. I don't know. I don't know if there are any other questions. Otherwise, I thank very much Jordan Treacle, Arne Dulsrud, Francesca Forno, and Anna Rapazzo and Bipul Chatterjee that just left for this really enriching conversation. And I really thank those of you who endured until the end. So please keep in touch for if you are interested in more links or resources or the PowerPoint presentations. Thank you very much. And the next appointment is a third and last meeting of this webinar series, which will focus on the farm to fork strategy of the EU. So I will keep you updated on this as well. Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you all.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Very good.
Ciao. Very good.